Om Prithvi Shantirantariksha Shantir Dyav Shantir Disha Shantiravantara Disha Shantiragni Shantir Vayu Shantiraditya Shantir Chandrama Shantir Nakshatrani Shantirapa Shantiroshadaya Shantir Vanaspataya Shantir Gau Shantiraja Shantirashva Shantir Purusha Shantir Brahma Shantir Brahmana Shantir Shantireva Shanti Shantirme Astu Shantihi. May there be peace on earth and in the sky. May there be peace in the water and in all directions. May there be peace in the plants, in the trees, and in animals. May there be peace in the hearts of all beings. May there be peace in everyone and in everything. Sarvetra sukhinas santu, sarve santu niramayaha, sarve bhadrani pashyantu, ma kaschit dukha bhag bhavet, sarvastaratu durgani, sarvo bhadrani pashyatu, sarvas sadbuddhimapnotu, sarvas sarvatra nandatu. May all be happy and healthy. May all see what is good, and may no one experience misery. May all overcome their obstacles and acquire good tendencies. May people everywhere find joy and fulfillment. Let us now spend some time touching the center of peace and joy in our hearts. A good way to begin the practice is to withdraw the scattered energies of the mind and bring them to rest on one point. That point can be our own breathing. Let us therefore practice breathing with awareness. As we breathe in, let us visualize that our body and mind are being filled with love, strength, and compassion. And as we breathe out, let us release all the stress, anxiety, and exhaustion in the body and mind. Let us practice this way for a while. Let us now turn our attention to the region of our heart. Although God is present everywhere and in everyone, the divine presence can be felt most clearly in our own hearts. We can meditate in any way we have been taught. To remain focused, we can take the help of a short mental prayer or a mantra or a divine name. Let us now spend some time dwelling on the presence of God in our hearts. Shanti 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 Harihi Om. We are very happy to have today in our midst Professor Jeffrey Long. Many of you have had a chance to hear him before. He has visited the center many times. But those of you who are be hearing him for the first time, here is some information. Professor Long is a professor of religion and Asian studies at Elizabethtown College in Pennsylvania. A major theme of his work is religious pluralism, which is also one of the topics he'll address today, in addition to rebirth. Jeff has published and presented a number of works on Hinduism, Jainism, and interfaith dialogue. He has published 3 books: A Vision for Hinduism Beyond Hindu Nationalism, Jainism, an Introduction, and The Historical Dictionary of Hinduism. A 4th book, An Introduction to Indian Philosophy with a Reader of Primary Sources, will be published later this year. He is currently working on a textbook on Hinduism in America and book-length projects on Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda. He has recently spoken at the Swami Shivananda Ashram in the Bahamas and at the Vedanta Society of New York. More than his academic and scholarly accomplishments, Jeff comes here today primarily as a spiritual seeker and a devotee of Sri Ramakrishna. Please welcome Professor Long.
Namaste, namaskar, good morning. Thank you very much, Swami Tyagananda, for that introduction and for inviting me here today. And my wife Mohla is with us here today as well. And thank you for the wonderful music at the beginning. That song's by my favorite artist, George Harrison. Last time I spoke here, I think it's been a couple of years, and I think you played My Sweet Lord that day too. So that's wonderful. It makes me feel even more welcome, right? I already feel very welcome and at home here. But hearing my favorite music from my favorite artist, it just, it's the icing on the cake. So today I'm going to talk about 2 topics and show how they're related. 2 ideas. One, the idea of rebirth, sometimes also called reincarnation, and then the idea of religious pluralism. And these ideas have something in common besides the fact they both start with re, right? You have rebirth and religious pluralism. But there's something else going on beneath the surface as well between these 2. When my personal journey to Vedanta began, these were 2 ideas that were especially attractive to me. This idea of reincarnation and the idea of religious pluralism, by which I mean the teaching that there are many true, many effective paths to God realization. So what is it that links these 2 ideas? These ideas are linked by what I'm going to call the scientific character of Vedanta. And what I mean by the scientific character of Vedanta is not to equate Vedanta with modern science in any kind of simplistic way. There are a lot of very interesting conversations about how Vedanta seems to relate very closely to, or maybe even anticipate, certain very interesting developments happening in the world of physics. I find all of that extremely interesting. I'm also not qualified to talk about it. I'm not a physicist. So when I say the scientific character of Vedanta, I'm not identifying Vedanta with modern science. Modern science is a wonderful, wonderful tool, but it does have certain limitations. It's not directed at questions of meaning and purpose. It's not directed at spiritual questions. It can have a bearing on these questions. It's not irrelevant to them. But what is the purpose of my life is not a scientific question. There's no experiment by which I can demonstrate empirically the answer to that question. But what I mean by the scientific character of Vedanta is a certain universality that science has. Science is something that can be pursued by anyone in principle. Physics, chemistry, and biology are just physics, chemistry, and biology. There's not an American physics, an Indian chemistry, a Japanese biology. People from all backgrounds can explore these fields. If you want to go and be a scientist, they're not going to say you're disqualified by your nationality, your ethnicity. It's just science, right? Because it's looking at universal trends. It's looking at the laws of nature that underlie all of our experiences. So there's a universality to science. What is true in scientific terms is true everywhere and for everyone. And the understanding I'm working with here is that the spiritual life is universal in a very similar way. We're all spiritual beings. We're all connected to the infinite. We're all connected to one another. And so seeking into the truths of the spiritual life in many ways can be akin to the study of science in that we're looking at things that are relevant to all people at all times. So when I say scientific in this context, I mean universal in the way that the laws of physics are universal, in the same way spirituality is universal. The forms through which we tend to access spirituality, though, unlike science, which has become more universal, In terms of spirituality, these tend to be very culture and tradition bound in a way that science seems not to be. Or no longer is. Science also, of course, is culture and tradition bound. If anyone's familiar with the now classic book by Thomas Kuhn, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, you see there is a culture of science and traditions in science also. But the aim of science is to point beyond particularity and to aim at generality. In this way, science is a type of philosophy. As defined by Aristotle, philosophy is the science of the universal essence of what is actual. Another way to say this is that philosophy is the search for general principles underlying particular matters of fact. So science is an example of this search applied to the physical world, and in fact it used to be called natural philosophy. So it's aimed at finding the general truths beneath the particular concrete realities of our lives. But religion tends to do almost the opposite, you could say. Religion takes universal truths, spiritual truths, and infuses them into particular forms that have the power to evoke an intensity of feeling within us that a more general and abstract discourse like science and philosophy do not. I mean, there are sort of strange people like me, who will, read a scientific article or a piece of philosophy and get very excited by that. But a lot of people find that very dry, very abstract. But religion communicates to us through symbols and stories that really grab us by the heart. In the words of Alfred North Whitehead, he says, "Religion connects the rational generality of philosophy with the emotions and purposes springing out of existence in a particular society, in a particular epoch, and conditioned by particular antecedents." And then he gives, I think, a really great definition of religion. He says, religion is the translation of general ideas into particular thoughts, particular emotions, and particular purposes. It is directed to the end of stretching the individual interest beyond its self-defeating particularity. In other words, it infuses these general universal ideas into very particular forms, and through those forms, the intent is that we stretch beyond our particularity and back to the general. So religion enables us to encounter abstract concepts like love, grace, power, creation, and infinity through concrete forms like Lord Krishna playing his flute, Lord Shiva's dance of creation and destruction, the Buddha meditating serenely at the feet of the Bodhi tree, Christ on the cross, concrete forms, concrete images. Its aim is to evoke these ideals in us with an intensity that abstract thought typically lacks. But it is also to take us beyond these concrete forms to a deeper appreciation and understanding of the general truths they express. Again, to quote Whitehead, to stretch the individual interest beyond its self-defeating particularity. All too often, however, this process of moving from the particular to the universal seems to be blocked. And this is a complaint I think a lot of people have about religion today. The concrete forms that evoke spiritual sentiments arouse feelings so intense that they can blind us to the fact that these forms are not the end in themselves, but point beyond themselves to the universal truth. One is reminded of the great dialogue one of the many great dialogues in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, in which the sage Yajnavalkya teaches his wife Maitreyi that it is not for the love of a husband that a husband is dear, it is for the love of the self, the Atman, the God within, that a husband is dear. It is not for the love of a wife that a wife is dear, it is for the love of God within that a wife is dear. It is not for the love of children that children are dear. It is for the love of God within them that children are dear. And so on. And he goes on to list a whole range of people and natural phenomena. And all of these things are wonderful and dear to us, not really as ends in themselves, but because through them we experience the self. Through them we experience Brahman, the highest reality. So in the same way, we could say, maybe a little more controversially, that it's not for the love of Jesus or Buddha or Allah or the deities of Hinduism that Jesus, Buddha, Allah, and the Hindu deities are dear, but for the love of the infinite to which they point. We forget this too easily, though, and become so attached to our chosen ideal, our Ishtadevata, not in the way that we should be, that would transport us from the unreal to the real, to a higher realization, but in a way that leads to what Swami Vivekananda calls sectarianism, bigotry, and fanaticism. We get stuck at the individual form and don't transcend beyond it to what the form is really there to embody for us. I see Vedanta as the science of God realization and as a universal process in which all beings are engaged. All of us here in the Vedanta Society, all human beings in the world, all the animals, all the plants, all the beings to which we wished peace this morning with our prayer, all are in the process of God realization. When my own journey to Vedanta began, I was troubled by the fact that religious ideas, at least as I had encountered them till that point, seemed not to point to universal truth of the kind the scientific method reveals, but that their intense particularity seemed to doom them to ethnocentrism and a localized relevance. Right? Everyone in the world has to believe what we believe. Everyone in the world has to follow what we follow. So the whole universal process of cosmic realization and consciousness becomes based on what you think about what happened at a particular place in the world 2,000 years ago, or what you think about a particular book written in a human language, rather than being something that is of a more general character. Two ideas that I encountered early in my journey, rebirth and religious pluralism, seem to point beyond the parochialism of religion as conventionally understood and toward the idea of a deeper universal science of spirituality. So that's my basic thesis today. My wife and I are both professors, and we're always telling our students, you need to have a thesis statement, right? What's your thesis? So my thesis today is that these two ideas, rebirth and religious pluralism, share in common the fact that even if they emerge within a specific historical religious context, they point beyond that, and in a certain way, if we reflect on these ideas, they break us out of that particularity and into the realm of the universal. So why were these ideas attractive to me personally? What drew me to rebirth and religious pluralism? First, I'll talk about rebirth, and I think one of the previous presentations I gave here at the center a few years ago, I talked about this in a little more detail. I won't repeat all of it then today, but I'll say a little bit for those of you who maybe are hearing me for the first time. But when I was very young, my father was in a very bad accident. He was rendered quadriplegic by that. He couldn't move. He died not too long after about a year and a half of a really terrible ordeal. And one of the things that became very, very evident to me, this might not persuade anyone else, but for me it was a very powerful experience, became very evident to me that we are not our physical body. Because I could see my father day to day living through the experience of fighting with his physical body. His physical body was his enemy. It was his prison. And when he passed away, I think that he believed he had freed himself from it. He took his own life, actually. And when that happened, I believed he had freed himself from the prison the body had become. We often identify with our body, right? It's one of the basic illusions that keeps us caught up in the whole cycle of rebirth. It's there in our language, right? If I cut my face while I'm shaving, I'll say, I cut myself. Yeah? Well, the self is actually fine. It's not been cut at all. But we're identifying with the physical form. But I could see, because of the accident my father had suffered, that the body and the essence of what he was as a person were two distinct things. They were not one and the same. The tradition I grew up in taught me that after you die, if you've been a good person and followed the right religious observances, you'll go to heaven and you'll be there forever after. And if you have not, then there's a very bad place where you go, and you're there forever and ever. And if you're pretty good and headed generally in the right way, but aren't really quite saintly yet, there's something called purgatory. I've once heard it jokingly called heaven's waiting room, where you spend some time becoming perfected and then you are allowed into heaven. So that's the teaching of the Catholic Church, essentially, as I understood it growing up. And as I reflected on these ideas after my father died, there were some aspects of it that I didn't agree with, I found. First of all, heaven and hell, it seemed to me that even the most wonderful people I knew weren't perfect. It didn't seem that I knew anyone that was quite good enough for an eternity of paradise. At the same time, I didn't know anyone that I thought was bad enough to go to hell. There's some good and some bad in everyone. So most of us seemed like, if the universe is fair, we seem to be bound for an afterlife that would be kind of like this one. It would have its ups and downs. It would have its good and bad. And so the idea of purgatory made a lot of sense. We go there, and then we finally, learn the lessons we need to learn and reach the goal that we're aiming for. But then I began to wonder, what was the purpose of this life? What was the purpose of this existence if we still have all this work to do in purgatory? Because my perception was that most of us have a lot of work to do in purgatory before we move on to perfection. So the idea occurred to me that maybe we're already in purgatory. Maybe this is it, and we just keep coming back until we finally get it right. And this is before I had studied Hinduism or Buddhism or, really learned about the world's religions. I was around 12 when I was thinking about all of this. And it was just an idea that made sense. And I was very religious, but I was also very independent-minded, and I had my own theory, and it made sense to me. So after about a year and a half or so, I had become very interested in world religions. I wanted to know what all the various traditions had to say about these deep issues like the afterlife. And finally, I came upon the Bhagavad Gita, and I believe I told that story here a few years ago as well, that it was actually in a church parking lot where there was a sale going on, and people were selling old items, and I found a Bhagavad Gita and bought it for $0.25. And when I was reading it, the first thing I came upon was its teaching of rebirth, that just as a person discards old and worn out clothing and takes on new clothing, so the soul discards the body when it no longer functions, takes on a new one, and continues its journey. This just made a lot of sense to me. Rebirth opens us to a more universal way of thinking than our conventional identification with a particular religion, ethnicity, nationality, or even something as basic as gender, because we are not this body and have likely inhabited many religions, many ethnicities, many nationalities, many genders, even many species. It's not only ethnocentrism, but anthropocentrism that is dethroned by the concept of rebirth. It's the great equalizer, right? We are all souls, and no matter what your social station, whether you're rich or poor, of course in India there's the idea of caste. In the West, we're very focused on race. That's a big part of, who are you? What is your identity? But according to the concept of rebirth, we are spiritual beings, and all of these things that everyone in the world gets so caught up in are just clothing, really. And clothing is not unimportant, but it's not who you are. It's not the essence of our being. In fact, a lot of the early Christians did believe in rebirth. It was a widely held idea. There are some passages in the Bible that are very suggestive of the idea of rebirth, or at least consistent with it. But by about the 5th century, there were people in the church who said, this idea of rebirth, we've had quite enough of this. And in fact, one of the people who really opposed it and was very explicit about why he opposed it was the Emperor Justinian. He famously said that if this idea is true, then someone who is a slave today might be an emperor in his next life, and the emperor today might be a slave. Well, this won't do, right? This undermines respect for authority. No rebirth. And if you really examine the idea of rebirth very deeply and consistently, it's quite radical. It really is the great equalizer. We are all souls. We are all spiritual beings, regardless of what clothing we're wearing on the outside. If rebirth is real, what is important is our individual character and the insights we're able to gain from our experiences, not which group this body belongs to. How can I be prejudiced if I myself have likely been all kinds of being in my soul journey? An idea of a heaven open to only one religious or cultural group is projecting our local prejudices onto the cosmos. The path to our highest realization must be a cosmic path, universally available, right? It's something that all souls are involved in, this journey, this process. So why should it be only for people who are wearing a certain type of clothes, right? Not for everybody. Rebirth is also moving closer today to the realm of science in the traditional sense, not just the kind of universal, the universality I've been speaking of, but hard science. It's not strictly speaking a scientific concept, right? There's no test for rebirth, There's a wonderful story, in fact, about this. The great, very brilliant skeptic Carl Sagan had a very friendly relationship with the Dalai Lama. And some of you might have heard this story before. He once, the Dalai Lama's very identity is based on the idea of rebirth, because he's been chosen as the Dalai Lama because of the belief that he's the same Dalai Lama who's been coming back again and again for the people of Tibet. So Carl Sagan once asked the Dalai Lama, what if we were to scientifically prove that there was no such thing as reincarnation? And the Dalai Lama, without hesitating at all, said, well, then we would have to advertise that far and wide, that this is not true, it's been disproven, and we shouldn't believe it anymore. Carl Sagan was really taken aback that such a central religious concept of Buddhism would be rejected easily by the Dalai Lama if science were to disprove it. But then the Dalai Lama said to him, how would you do that? Right? How would you disprove rebirth? Right? Because it's not really a scientific idea. There's no soulometer that measures souls and can tell you if this soul is the same one as this soul and so forth. But there is a phenomenon that has come to the attention of some researchers of children who claim to have memories of, sometimes fairly detailed memories of people who've died long ago. And often it's very difficult to account for these apparent memories in any obvious way. Now, this is a field where lots and lots of skepticism is obviously needed. Children, of course, have great imaginations, and they love to tell stories, and they love to be the center of attention. And if they've got the attention of an adult, they're going to tell a story. And they want to make adults happy. That's natural for children. And it might not always seem that way with children, but they basically want adults to be happy with them. And so if the adult thinks, oh, this sounds like a past life account, and then asks leading questions, well, did you see this? Well, did you see that? The child will say, oh, yes, I saw that. So it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. But there was a scholar at University of Virginia named Ian Stevenson who began really pioneering work in collecting these stories of children and trying to separate the ones that seem to really have leading questions involved and to be sort of dubious from the ones where the children really seem to have information that they would have no other way of attaining. And there have been some criticisms of Stevenson's methodology because he was quite excited about this, and he includes some accounts that some other scholars have said, well, actually there are some problems here. But his successor at University of Virginia, Jim Tucker, has continued this work. And in fact, I was curious to see how credible his institution found it to be. And one thing that was interesting that I discovered on the University of Virginia website is they're using Jim Tucker's research to help raise funds. So they seem to like it. They're saying that this is research that's happening in our psychology department. So Jim Tucker has tightened up Stevenson's methodology. You hear lots of these stories in India, right, from children who seem to be having memories of past lives. Same in Buddhist countries like Thailand. He's excluded practically all of those from consideration. He says if there's already a cultural predisposition to believe in rebirth, that could contaminate the stories, right? So even though some of those may be what we would call genuine cases, let's be really rigorous and scientific and exclude those. What you really need is to find an account of a child who, again, has these memories, apparent memories, information that the child has no other way of acquiring, and in a context where there is not already a predisposition to believe in rebirth. And lo and behold, Jim Tucker came across this little boy from Oklahoma named Ryan. And I first heard about this case on the NBC Nightly News, and that's what directed me to Jim Tucker's work. I knew about Stevenson's work, which is fairly famous, but Tucker's continuing his work. Ryan's story is quite amazing, and even if you look at it with a skeptical mind, it does raise questions that are very difficult to answer without some concept of reincarnation. First of all, Ryan's family does not believe in reincarnation. They are Southern Baptists, and they were raised to believe that the idea of rebirth is the work of the devil. So they're not inclined to believe in rebirth, and they're certainly not inclined to think of their child as someone's reincarnation. But as a young child, around 3 or 4, Ryan began having these very disturbing experiences. He had these vivid memories of another life, and he enjoyed that life, and he was always crying that he wanted to go back. He wanted to go to his house in California because it was bigger and it had a swimming pool. He started talking about his life there, And one day he and his mother were looking at a book about the golden age of Hollywood, and he saw a photograph. It was a still from an old Mae West film, so 1930s. And he pointed at this man who's playing a gangster, and he says, "That's me." And this is another interesting case. If you're skeptical about rebirth stories, and again, it's good to be skeptical, very often people claim to remember being some very famous person. Well, famous people's lives are well known, so those facts are available, and it might be that one has convinced oneself of that. So, how many thousand people has Cleopatra reincarnated as, for example? I mean, these are just those famous examples. But this actor that Ryan pointed to was not a well-known actor, and in fact, his name was not listed anywhere in the book. And the little boy was disturbed enough by these memories that he was having that his parents actually contacted Dr. Tucker, say, "Can you help our child? He's having these experiences." So Tucker began to investigate, and they discovered that the actor in the photograph was named Marty Martin. He only acted in one film, but for most of his career he was a Hollywood agent. He got acting jobs for other people. When he was younger, he had danced on Broadway, which is something Ryan talked about doing, dancing on Broadway. He said that his house with the swimming pool was on a street with the word rock in the title. Well, Martin lived on Roxbury Avenue in a house with a swimming pool. Really funny detail that this little boy mentioned. He mentioned that he had been married 5 times. It's not something you would expect a child to say, but Martin was in fact married 5 times. So Ryan was beginning to look like that great case that past life researchers are looking for, of someone whose head is full of information that he can't have any other way. Because Martin was a relatively unknown figure, this information was not available on the internet. You had to go to public records, and then finally they located his children and had conversations with them. His children are, of course, elderly people by this time. But then Ryan said something that made Tucker question whether this was really a valid case. And another thing about Ryan is he wasn't being prompted. He was saying these things very spontaneously and unwantedly because his parents didn't like this whole rebirth idea. But he made the comment that, he said, "I don't understand why God would let you live to be 61 years old and then make you come back as a baby." And according to Marty Martin's death certificate, he actually died at the age of 59. So when Ryan said 61, that made Tucker think, okay, there's an inaccuracy here. But they followed up, they checked with Marty Martin's children and did some further research, and it turned out that Martin actually died at the age of 61 and that the public record was incorrect. So here you have data that actually disproves the public record coming from a child in Oklahoma who's not biologically related to Martin. He had no contact with him. So it's a really remarkable case. And cases like this are causing more and more scholars to question the dominant view of many in the scientific community that all we are is a collection of material forces, material particles and energies randomly organizing, and that consciousness and self-identity and so forth are just sort of an accidental effect of physical processes. Because if Ryan has all this information, then there is some way that the consciousness of Marty Martin is connected with or present in some way to this little boy in Oklahoma, which means consciousness is something that is transferable across space and time. It's not bound to any mechanistic physical process. And Tucker speculates about this a lot in one of his books, and he talks about how certain dimensions of quantum theory are actually open to this type of understanding. And what I found interesting as a scholar of Vedanta reading this was that if you just change the terminology a little bit, he's talking about things we find in the Upanishads. He's talking about the Atman, he's talking about Brahman, he's talking about rebirth, karma, all these things are there. He's not using those words, and Tucker himself is not a scholar of Indian religions, which again gives his work in a way even more credibility. He's come upon this just by looking at the evidence. So the idea of rebirth is not only scientific in the way of, in the sense that it leads us to a more general or universal understanding of ourselves, but it may actually become, or seems to be becoming, a topic of science in the traditional sense. So there's a scientificity to rebirth. What about religious pluralism? Similarly, when I was growing up, and around the same period when I was having all of my various reflections about rebirth and beginning to look at world's religions, I encountered people who said that the followers of religions other than their own were going to hell. And in fact, I was told more than once that I was going to hell. I was Catholic. And a lot of these folks were members of other Christian denominations, and they said, no, you guys are the wrong type of Christian. So, forget about Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, everyone else, atheists, because, just people who believe the way they do are going to go to heaven. And this really disturbed me a lot. In fact, the idea of God that I had been taught was that God was loving, and at minimum, at least fair, right? And it seemed to me that if you were going to hell because you followed the religion you'd been raised with, and that only a small handful of people on earth were actually not going to hell because they were members of the right religion, it would mean that God had created the vast majority of human beings knowing fully well that they were going to suffer for all eternity. That seems just like a really cruel and sadistic idea of God, and not the one that I understood to be true. And of course I was thinking about the idea of divine incarnation, because in Christianity you have the idea that God became a human being, God came to earth as Jesus Christ, and that this was necessary to save humanity from its sins. Now, I was always a big science fiction fan. I grew up on Star Trek and Star Wars and things like that, and a question that came to me around this period was, well, what about people on other planets? What about other life forms? Is there a Jesus on every planet, saving the people of those worlds from sin? And if that might be the case, what about just Earth itself? Because we have all these cultures that were separated from one another for many hundreds of years. Wouldn't there be a Jesus for everybody? There could be a Jesus for the Incas, there could be a Jesus in India, a Jesus in China, and just Jesuses everywhere. And of course, this is what in the Hindu tradition is called avatar. Right? And again, when I was reading the Gita, I saw this idea confirmed. Krishna says in the 7th verse of the Gita, whenever dharma declines and there's a rise in adharma, a rise in chaos, then I manifest myself. He comes whenever he's needed, right? He appears again and again. And another, I think, very powerful verse of the Gita, just 4 verses later, Krishna says, in whatever way human beings approach me, thus do I receive them. All paths, Arjuna, lead to me. And in fact, this same verse was cited by Swami Vivekananda in his first speech at the Parliament of World Religions in 1893. The way he phrased it, his translation was, whosoever comes to me through whatsoever form, I reach him. All men are struggling through paths which in the end lead to me. So the part of this verse that I find especially powerful and especially important, when Krishna says, in whatever way human beings approach me, thus do I receive them. That thus is very important, right? It's tata in Sanskrit. And in fact, if you know Sanskrit, it's tata eva, tataiva with the proper sandhi, right? So there's a very, very strong emphasis being given on the word thus. Thus do I receive them. In other words, if I approach Krishna as Christ, and someone else approaches Krishna as Buddha, and someone else approaches Krishna as the cosmos, in that way, that is, thus does Krishna receive them. It's not that at a certain point they suddenly rise, oh, it was really Krishna and I was wrong to think of it as Jesus or as Buddha or as the cosmos. These are just the forms the Lord takes, and it's in those forms that the Lord receives those who approach. And so in whatever way we approach the infinite, in whatever way approach the divine, that form becomes the form for us, and it becomes our Ishtadevata, and that infinite reality manifests to us through that form. And we're not wrong to hold to that form, so long as we understand that everyone else has their form as well. So there's a scientific universality to this way of thinking. The truths of the spiritual life, like the laws of science, need to be universally available. Unless the universe truly was designed by a capricious and unjust deity with no regard for whether living beings achieve realization, in which case it's time to join the rebellion, in my opinion. This is not the deity to which the world's religions point, at least when they're at their most profound. Saving truths, spiritual truths, are available to all, regardless of which religion or which philosophy they use. And in fact, Aldous Huxley talks about this very famously in his book, The Perennial Philosophy. The metaphysic that recognizes a divine reality substantial to the world of things and lives and minds, the psychology that finds in the soul something similar to or even identical with divine reality, the ethic that places humanity's final end in the knowledge of the immanent and transcendent ground of all being, the thing is immemorial and universal. The thread of a universal science of spirituality can be found across the world's religions and philosophies. In the words of Sarvapalli Radhakrishnan, Vedanta is, quote, not a religion, but religion itself in its most universal and deepest significance. Now, if I use the name Vedanta for this universal science, someone might object. It looks like you're getting hung up on particularity. You're identifying the universal truth with this particular Indian system of philosophy. That's a fair point, and I think we need to be sensitive to that. But if you look at the original Sanskrit meaning of Vedanta, it's a compound of two words. We're getting Sanskrit lessons today, I guess. Veda and Anta. Veda refers to the texts that we call the Vedas, but its original meaning is wisdom. And Anta is cognate with our English word end. It's the end of wisdom. It's the aim or the goal or the purpose to which all wisdom points. So in the language I've been using today, it's the scientific spirituality whose thread you can find running through all religions and all traditions. And Swami Vivekananda said this very beautifully. He said, by the Vedas, no books are meant. They mean the accumulated treasury of spiritual laws discovered by different persons in different times. Just as the law of gravitation existed before its discovery and would exist if all humanity forgot it, so is it with the laws that govern the spiritual world. The moral, ethical, and spiritual relations between soul and between individual spirits and the Father of all spirits were there before their discovery and would remain even if we forgot them. Elsewhere he says, the whole body of supersensuous truths, having no beginning or end, and called by the name of the Vedas, is ever existent. The Creator himself is creating, preserving, and destroying the universe with the help of these truths. The person in whom this supersensuous power is manifested is called a rishi, and the supersensuous truths which he realizes are called the Vedas. In regard to the books known as Vedas, he says these are a series of books which, to our minds, contain the essence of all religion. But we do not think they alone contain the truths. So let's call it Vedanta, call it spiritual science, call it the perennial philosophy, but it's something to which many religions and philosophies point, various dimensions of which can be found in them. Now, this idea has faced a lot of criticism in recent years, including from within the Hindu community, which is where it really, I think, has found some of its most powerful expression in the teaching of people like Sri Ramakrishna, people like Swami Vivekananda, the Holy Mother. But every now and then you'll find people saying, and it seems to happen on Facebook and Twitter most of the time. I haven't encountered it so much in person. But, this idea makes us weak. We become all accepting, but these other religions come and they beat us up, and, we need to be tough and resistant to that. Well, there is a valid point, I think, in that objection. There is a worry that if it becomes a sentiment, if it simply becomes saying, all religions are the same, so, it doesn't really matter, what you believe or what you do, there is danger there of losing one's spiritual and intellectual bearings, I think. This is, and I don't want to get too political, but when I started hearing phrases in the last couple months like alternative facts, I got really worried, because the idea of this philosophy is not to deny that there is an objective reality and that there is truth. There is truth, but truth is complex, and it can be perceived in many ways and approached in many ways. So there are differences among religions. There are contradictions sometimes. There are religions that teach that there is no such thing as reincarnation. Well, I think there is such a thing as reincarnation, so to that extent, I don't agree with those religions. But a religion is not just an all-or-nothing proposition, in my opinion. Religions are complexes of many, many different claims and teachings. And as Sri Ramakrishna said, there's a mix of sand and sugar there, right? There are claims which can be affirmed, and this is what we're saying in religious pluralism. There's some sugar there in every one of these traditions. There's also some sand there in every one of these traditions, and we have to be discerning. We have to use viveka, right? We have to use our minds and our logic to differentiate between what is true and what is destructive. And very often it depends on the intent of the person speaking as well. Sometimes somebody can say something that literally, objectively speaking, is true, but they're saying it in a hateful way, in a way that's designed to create destructive ends. And there are times when people say things that aren't quite, in fact, my wife and I had an interesting discussion about this the other day. Sometimes people say things that aren't really literally true, but they mean well by it. They're doing something constructive with that. So we have to be very discerning about what language means in a particular context, and what is the philosophy that's being expressed. And very often it's not happening at the literal level. It's happening on a more profound level. I'm mindful of the time because we all have other things to do today, so I want to sort of wrap up my remarks. But there are many, many, many ways that one can talk and think about this idea of pluralism. One of the most famous images that many of you may already know is the blind man and the elephant. You have a group of blind men, each grasping a different part of the elephant, describing it differently, and then fighting amongst themselves over what an elephant's like. But of course, they're all partially correct and partially incorrect. They've all seized part of the truth. But to the extent that they exclude the truths of the others, their view is only partial. So this, I think, is not only a scientific way of thinking, right? Swami Vivekananda talks about the spiritual truths being universal, just like the laws of nature. But I want to conclude by saying that I think this is also just a very important idea for our time. My feeling as I get older is that with each year that passes, I'm seeing people become, and no matter what their background, no matter what their philosophy or political persuasion or religion, less tolerant of the views of others, less willing to learn, less open-minded. And I'm going to quote a very unusual person here, but the comedian Eddie Izzard, I think, is a very wise man. And I recently heard him say, I'm reaching out to other countries, and I want to say, can we learn from you? Can you learn from us? I think this is the way forward for humanity. And I think that this century is a very key century for us, the 21st century. He says this is the century we either make it fair for all 7 billion people in the world, or we're going to wipe ourselves off the face of the planet. This has become a very critical time, I think. And of course, everyone in all periods of history think their time is very critical, right? The Pandavas and the Kauravas at Kurukshetra said that this is a very critical time. Well, this is our critical time. And we need to really develop a philosophy, develop a way of thinking and speaking where we turn down the temperature quite a bit, both literally with regard to the planet, right, climate change, but also metaphorically with regard to our tempers and our willingness to listen to each other and accept one another. Because there is wisdom everywhere. There's sugar everywhere, as Sri Ramakrishna would say. And we need to look for that and discern that. So thank you all very much.
Thank you for that very, very insightful presentation. There's so much to discuss and to understand about rebirth and religious pluralism. So we will continue this discussion over a cup of tea and coffee in the sitting room, and so we'll have more time to discuss. And if you have any questions or remarks, keep them, and then we can discuss it in the other room. When you're speaking about rebirth, I was reminded about Holy Mother's remark. There is a place near Benares, place called Sarnath, very ancient Buddhist settlement, monasteries, and the ruins are there. And so once when Holy Mother Sharda Devi was taken to Sarnath, and it's a great place, a lot of pilgrims and tourists come to see that. And so when Mother went, there were a lot of people who had gone to see that. And then Mother, looking at them, the Holy Mother remarked, and she said, the very people who built those places are now come to see and are appreciating it. So we don't remember our past. And actually, when I first read that, it was actually an interesting thought that those of us who have been reading books of Ramakrishna, the Gospel of Ramakrishna, Holy Mother, Swamiji, it's quite possible that when you're reading the Gospel and see group of people sitting in Ramakrishna's room, any of us might have been those people. We just don't remember. And maybe that some good impressions we gathered in that last birth, maybe we didn't realize our God then, but then we have come here with all these preconceived, pre-existing condition, pre-existing spiritual condition, which made us open to Vedanta. And when you were speaking about rebirth, one other thing I remembered, I had not thought about it for many years, but when I was very young, I was probably a teenager, and when I was very attracted. The first person I was attracted was Swami Vivekananda, even before I read about Ramakrishna and Holy Mother. And crazy as this might sound, when I read in the book that Swamiji did horse riding, and I was like teenager, I may have been that horse which he ran. and for a kid growing in India, it's not unusual. It's not like terrible. Like how are you an animal in your first birth? It just felt completely natural. I didn't feel anything. Anyway, that was one long lost hidden memory which suddenly came up in my mind just now. So thank you once again, and we're looking forward to your next visit. Next Sunday, we'll have our annual Freedom Festival. That will be on 2nd of July. Normally we do it on 4th, but I thought it will be good to do it on Sunday, so then 4th of July we could do some other interesting things. So on 2nd, as we do usually, we'll have music, we'll have a potluck lunch, a reflection on freedom, and so let's welcome all of you next Sunday. And for potluck, it's an opportunity to bring your favorite dishes. If you need some ideas about what to do, you can speak with Henna after the service. On Wednesday, we begin a new text. So last Sunday, we concluded the study of the Gita. And so this Wednesday, we will begin the study of a small Upanishad. It's called the Amrita Bindu Upanishad. It's got only 22 verses, and so that's the new text we will begin on Wednesday. On Tuesday and Saturday, our Arati and meditation will also continue as usual. One other announcement, a new book has arrived called Knowing the Knower, a Jnana Yoga manual. So, many of you are aware that this book was expected. This is a companion volume to my earlier book called The Walking the Walk. So it's just arrived this past week at the bookstore. So if you are interested, you can take a look. Okay, now we'll conclude with a prayer, and may the Divine Being, who is the Father in heaven of the Christians, Holy One of the Jewish faith, Allah of the Muslims, Buddha of the Buddhists, Tao of the Taoists, Ahura Mazda of the Zoroastrians, the Great Spirit of the Native Americans, and Brahman of the Hindus, lead us from the unreal to the real, from darkness to light, from death to immortality. May we be granted strength, freedom, and clear understanding. May we learn to see God in our own hearts and in everyone around us. May God bless us all and fill our hearts with gratitude, grace, and love. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Peace, peace, peace be unto you.